Good morning, and thank everyone for coming. My name is Parker Van Houten. I am a fifth-year senior at the University of Kentucky. I study vocal performance and arts administration at the university, and I'm very happy to be here on this brisk and blustery morning. So our first presenter today is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University, the author of the books Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, Hate Crime Hoax, and the $50 Million Question. Please welcome Wilfred Reilly. And our next speaker is the author of 11 books, including Thought Criminal, Beyond Woke, Google Archipelago, The Digital Gulag, and The Simulation of Freedom, just to name a few. Please welcome Michael Rectenwald. And finally, these gentlemen are joined by Kylie Carlino, the Senior Media Relations Strategist at Regnery Publishing, who will moderate the panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this. I'm really excited about this conversation. We're going to be talking about the state of speech in book publishing specifically. The dystopian idea of book banning is becoming a trend among American publishers. Regnery Publishing, where I work, is a conservative book publishing company based in Washington, D.C. And over a 75-year history, we have gained a reputation for publishing books that New York publishers won't touch, one of them being Mr. Reilly's book Taboo. Book banning is a reality we will be discussing today. It happens among publishers before a book even makes it to the public eye. It happens among distributors who have apologized for shipping taboo topic books that disagree with the mainstream sentiment, and among booksellers like Amazon who have even refused to carry books for the same reason. Will, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, talk about your book a little bit, why you talk about what do you talk about in Taboo, and why is it important to today's discussion?
Yeah, so Taboo is a book, it's subtitled The 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. And what I do is look at 10 of the more prominent kind of public narratives in society and see what the facts underlying them, if any, happen to be. So I look at the Black Lives Matter narrative, for example, which is that there's an epidemic number of African American unarmed men being killed by police. I look at sort of the broader narrative that there's a massive amount of interracial crime and conflict in the country. And I really go across the spectrum. I look at the idea of systemic racism. Are there hidden forces in America that make it very difficult for people of color to succeed? And to sort of switch it up, in the final chapter, I look at the things the alt-right says. The idea, for example, that diverse societies just don't work. And what I find is that a lot of these narratives are, the word I usually use is bullshit, although I'll avoid this in front of a polite audience like this one. But I find that there's very little factual basis for a lot of the things that mass media kind of promotes in modern society. So in terms of the Black Lives Matter argument, for example, the total number of unarmed African-American men that were killed by police last year turns out to be 17. And you can really go into this data at some length. I mean, the total number of people overall that were shot and killed by the police last year, and as in almost every year, was under 1,000. Of those, about 250 were black, were African American. The majority of these people turned out to be attacking the police with guns, knives, in one case, a Cadillac Escalade. So the core of this argument that we're constantly confronted with is unreal. It's fictional. And there seems to be a problem not so much with people understanding this reality, but with people expressing it. And that turned out to be true for most of the other things as well. Interracial crime, at least in the traditional sense, kind of a violent incident involving either a black perp and a white victim or a white perp and a black victim, was about 3% of crime. The most recent year on record, which is what I use in the book, there were 600,000 of these cases, and there were about 20 million total crimes. Of the interracial crimes that did occur, about 90% of them, 89%, were actually black on white. Now, again, this is not an epidemic in any direction. The person most likely to kill you in the USA is your ex-wife, at least for males. But I mean, that is a bit of an indication of what's actually going on, how real a lot of what you hear is. And this is just true on and on down the line. I mean, in terms of the idea of systemic hidden bias, the claim there is really what Dr. Ibram Kendi says, if you're familiar with that gentleman, but that any large gap in performance between groups has to be due to some kind of hidden, subtle racism, unless you want to propose that it's due to genetic inferiority. In fact, what I found is that adjusting for really basic things like age, the most common age for a black man in the USA is 27. For a white man, it's 58, closed almost all of the gaps. Just so on down the line. I mean, the major alt-right claims, diverse societies don't function, for example, were no more likely to be accurate. I mean, large countries have been diverse since ancient Rome. If you own a lot of land, generally, there are a lot of different kinds of people that live on it. So the point of the book, I think, is that many things that almost everyone seems to believe really aren't accurate. And we believe these things because we're being told them by people. So I look at that, I examine why. And apparently, this is a very controversial thing to do. And this came on top of a previous book, Hate Crime Hoax, which makes the point that a lot of the very high profile kind of racial incidents that we've seen in recent years, Covington Catholic here in Kentucky, Jussie Smollett, obviously mocked by Dave Chappelle as the mad Frenchman, Juicy Smollett, so on, turned out simply not to be true. So the topic of both these books, I think, which we'll get into, is that a lot of things that we're all expected to believe aren't real. And so the question is why we're expected to believe them. And there are many people that object to this sort of line of inquiry taking place, I think. So that's it for me. I am an associate professor at Kentucky State University here in Frankfurt. Quick drive over from Lexington. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Will. And Michael, can you briefly tell us about your book, Thought Criminal, and how that's prepared for you to talk about this discussion?
Sure. Yes, I'm Michael Rectenwald, and Thought Criminal is my 11th book. I was a full professor at NYU in global liberal studies, and I was basically a leftist, a Marxist, and then the social justice excesses in the university started to alarm me. And I saw the sort of totalitarian character of what they represented. And I started to speak out against it on Twitter first. And then I was interviewed by the student newspaper there. And 2 days after the interview appeared, I was pressured into forced into a leave of absence and driven off campus, condemned by a committee called the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group. And effectively, my academic career was ruined. So since then, I've been writing. I have written Springtime for Snowflakes, which is a memoir that treats my journey through the academic left and back out. And then another book called Google Archipelago, which treats the same sort of ideology as it permeates big tech, and how big tech and why big tech is a leftist authoritarian outfit, cartel really is what it is. And then the next book was Beyond Woke, in which I treat all of these subjects from big tech through. I'm dealing with the social justice ideology and all of its permutations. And then finally, Thought Criminal is a novel. And that novel treats, it's based on the premise of a neuroscientist who has come up with a theory about a virus, and he thinks that the virus is actually being perpetrated by the state, and that it has a function which is to connect the neurons of the neocortex of the various subjects to this massive database and processing system called collective mind. And there's a vaccine program, and he believes that the vaccine is actually doing something other than what they say. In fact, it turns out to be true that the vaccine serves, in fact, to make the virus more effective and to make it more permanent, so that almost all of the thinking is supplied and replaces one's own thinking. It's all supplied by this body called collective mind, which is this vast database processing system. So he's a thought criminal because he's trying to maintain his own individual autonomy and thinking process at the risk of being infected with the virus, which will then eradicate his personality, in effect. And he is amongst a group called a network of thought deviationists. And that derives from, basically, I take that language from the Soviet Union, in which basically dissidents were considered deviationists from the party line. So this is about totalitarianism and how it eradicates individual thought and attempts to replace it with party line thinking.
All right, thank you. Yeah. So you guys have published some pretty against the mainstream media messaging topics. You've published some controversial stuff that have really gotten people's ire up in a lot of ways. Among publishers over the past year, we have seen books signed and then canceled, and or just authors refused to be signed, were not signed on at all by, for example, Simon and Schuster. Mike Pence was signed by Simon and Schuster to publish a memoir, but then cancel culture got in there too, and a bunch of employees made a petition demanding they cancel Mike Pence's memoir because his policies were, quote, racist and sexist. The CEO, Jonathan Karp, said Simon & Schuster would commit to publishing a broad range of views, and so they ended up committing to publish that. But earlier in 21, they had canceled a man's book named Josh Hawley. I don't know if you've heard of him. And he was canceled by Simon & Schuster because he objected to certifying the 2020 presidential election. So he was, for the same reasons, his political stance. That's why he was canceled by a publishing company. And so I wanted to hear from you guys. Michael, have you had any difficulty with publishers not wanting to publish your books because they didn't want to promote your message?
Yes, I did. When I wrote Springtime for Snowflakes, one of the things I examined was transgender ideology. And I'm not talking about transgender here. I'm talking about the ideology and the cultural trend and agenda. And so I analyzed what was going on with transgender ideology, and I decided that it had to do with postmodernism, which is a school of philosophical thought, so to speak, if you can call it thought, that basically suggests that reality is determined by language. So that reality is really a social and linguistic construct that's made by language itself, and that is there's no out there. Really, everything is produced by the subject. It's very subjectivistic, and it's actually nihilistic in terms of epistemology. But what I was getting at here is I talked about how transgenderism depends on naming, in effect. You are who you say you are. So it all comes down to words, and language determines reality. So anyway, I had a publisher, St. Martin's Press. We were all through the whole revision process, maybe 7 times. That's how they were. Adam Bella was the editor, and he's a conservative, actually, of a certain ilk. And he tried to get the book through, but the transgender thing tripped it up. St. Martin's Press is actually an academic press, but he had a certain imprint called All Points Books, and they tripped it up over the transgender issue. So I had to move it to a different publisher, which I'm perfectly happy about because I could say exactly what I wanted to say without any apologies or whatever.
Yeah. How about you, Will? We're discussing the book business. Do you feel your choice of very edgy topics has gotten you in trouble with publishing?
Yeah, I have a great relationship with you guys, but there's a reason that this came out with Regnery. In all honesty, I think that there's a great deal of resistance to a whole range of topics in modern academia and in modern publishing. I don't think that's much of a secret for this audience, but I'll tell you, I have a background in sales. I was a sales director for Marcus Evans International in Chicago for a couple of years. And how I got my first book published was that I just identified the emails and the phone numbers for the executives at publishing companies, which isn't hard to do. They're on the websites. And I just made a pitch call. Like, I'm a pretty serious guy. I'm a professor at a local university. I have this background. I'd be interested in setting up 20 minutes talking about a book idea. And everyone accepted. It was enjoyable, great fun's the phrase that comes to mind, talking to all these guys in a new field. But a lot of them said very openly, when I mentioned the premise of the book, Hate Crime Hoax, there's no way we can publish this. One of them actually called me kid. The guy was about 70. I think I'm a little past that point, but it's just sort of interesting. Like, you don't understand how our business works. There's no way we can get this out. I'll tell you, there's a book you should check out called Crying Wolf by a guy named Laird Wilcox, which is the first version of Hate Crime Hoax. And this guy, Laird Wilcox, who's an extremism researcher, conservative guy down at Kansas, tried to publish this book for something like 4 years. He finally got a deal with one publisher. I forget the name of the business, but was told just before publication, when they had a cover, this is something post, for example, Tawana Brawley, that we're simply not going to be able to release. So that obviously exists. I mean, I openly talked to people who said, you seem like a nice guy. This topic's not one we're going to go with. And I somehow feel that that would have been a little bit of a different situation if I'd written a book called, Anti-Racist Toddler. So there definitely are prejudices in every field. I mean, there are fields like the U.S. military, obviously, that lean right. But in publishing, I think across the arts in general, in academia, in the NGO sector, you're going to run into a lot of people that lean toward the political left. And that's going to affect the topics you can, quote unquote, get away with. I actually avoided the trans issue in Taboo because the book's already based around 10 or 11 major taboos. So I didn't want to have to fight about this one. I mean, I think it's obvious that men aren't women, if you want to put it that way, but chose not to really take that on, full frontally. That may be my next book, although I think Mr. Rectenwald, my co-author, and a number of people have already covered that ground pretty well. But yeah, there really is a form of censorship. It comes mostly from the left today that makes the situation such that saying men aren't women would be a wildly controversial statement. And yeah, that's something people can notice and people can react to. But yes, that obviously has affected me.
Yeah. And Michael, does censorship in the publishing world and in the media at large today resemble any historical precedents that you've done in your research?
Well, yeah. It's very reminiscent of Stalinism, frankly, and the Cultural Revolution in China, where in China, for example, they effectively ran on a rampage, destroying the four olds, customs, habits, idea. I don't know all the four olds, but you can look it up on Wikipedia, where they'll tell you lies about mostly everything. But anyway, the four olds, and basically they destroyed all remnants of traditional culture and routed out what they thought of as bourgeois ideology or bourgeois ideas. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union, except they didn't have a cultural revolution. It just was basically routing out all dissent and dissidents and putting them in gulags. I mean, so we're having a soft cultural socialist revolution in the United States. I mean, this should not be a surprise to anyone to realize that we are undergoing that. And as such, it has permeated all of these culture industries, the publishing houses. I think we're actually late in coming to this, but almost every cultural institution in the United States and around the world. But, this seems to be the hotbed or the belly of the beast in terms of where this is actually coming from. So it seems that it really resembles the Soviet Union. It resembles the Eastern Bloc, where these dissidents would have to create what they called Samizdat books and publish. Basically, they called them parallel structures. They tried to develop parallel cultural institutions and various types of other mechanisms by which to survive, first of all, to keep their sanity, second of all, and third of all, to try to flourish creatively and otherwise. So, yeah, it very much is to me, we're undergoing something that I think is very serious. It is not simply a joke. Wokeness isn't just funny, although there's a funny book about it right here. Wokeness is actually a very dangerous ideological means by which to exclude and destroy people, and it's not a joke. So yeah, I think this is a very serious situation that very much resembles the Soviet Union. And in fact, I just read an article before this talk called "The Sovietization of the United States," which talks about all. And this is from a Russian dissident who fled the Soviet Union. He defected, and he said, "What's happening here it's making his hair stand on end." And also, I've heard from other people from China that came here, and they're saying the same thing. This reminds them of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So publishing is definitely one of the elements, but it's very widespread.
One note I would make about my co-author's comment there, we're already seeing the development of quote unquote parallel institutions in the USA, where you're seeing almost separate right wing, if you will, and then sort of mainstream center left medias. I mean, you're seeing alternative academic institutions. Hillsdale College is one we were just talking about. But this is actually a major problem for my field of political science, because you're creating two bases. You're creating two Americas, which is something that even George Bush, even Barack Obama, fairly partisan fellows, spoke out against quite recently. But the audience base for Fox News, last I looked, was about 91% conservative. And Fox at least identifies itself as somewhat ideologically conservative. But you see the same thing in reverse. The base for the New York Times, the Washington Post, so on down the line, leans 80, 90% or more to the left. It's over 95% last I looked at any real data for MSNBC. So not to just drop a bunch of figures on you guys, but we are moving toward this sort of two camps that disagree on everything, but because they're receiving different information. For example, I mentioned last line, but I mentioned the total number of unarmed black men shot by the cops in a typical year. It's about 10, maybe 20. A good, well-done recent poll from the Skeptic Research Center found that the average liberal American thinks it's 10,000. This isn't me exaggerating. They asked a bunch of people who identified as leftists or very liberals how many people they thought this was. And it was more than 35% thought it was about 10,000, if I recall correct. No, 35% thought it was about 1,000. I don't want to exaggerate. 15% thought it was about 10,000, and about 10% thought it was more than that. So the constant panic on one side of the aisle and the reaction to that, something like the COVID vaccine, sometimes extremism on the right, reflects entirely different bases of knowledge and thought and even information, which is very problematic. That's a good point.
Yeah, I'd agree with. Can I just add something? I agree with that, and I think there is a split. There's two, at least two Americas, but I would like to add, though, that one of them has the cultural power. They control all the cultural industries. They control, for the most part, all of academia, other than a few schools like Hillsdale and a few others. They're controlling most of the publishing world. They're controlling most of the media, and Fox notwithstanding. But even those institutions like Fox is getting tremendous pressure from this left, which is trying to marshal all their forces to get people canceled. There's been numerous campaigns to get Tucker Carlson canceled, for example, and this is just ongoing. He's luckily got quite a spine, so I admire him for that. But this is not. Yeah, this is true. But I would say that in this sense, there's a kind of parallel structure that just has to be almost subversive as against the dominant culture.
Yeah, can I add one final comment? Yeah, just going back and forth. One final comment here also is that the bias that you see in the media and academia, I mean, again, a set of numbers, the media leans about 93% left. That's a famous study by Pew in 2004. That's the number of national media journalists that are, if I recall correctly, leftist, liberals, or left-leaning moderates. See about the same in academia. In my field of political science, we have about 20 Democrats for every Republican. But one result of this is that the extremists can tell normal people that they are extremists. I mean, when Murdoch founded Fox News, he was asked bluntly, who the hell do you think the audience will be for this conservative TV station? He said 51% of America, because he just looked at demographics. He had seen that all of the pre-existing media was on this one side of the fence, dividing two equally sized camps. But I mean, in academia, it's not 50-50. It is, again, 95-5. So the people that are coming out of fields like gender studies are saying things that are in fact rejected. And I don't want to focus on this one fringe topic, but that are in fact rejected by the massive majority of Americans, but that are presented as utterly mainstream. This is what the experts say. We hear this a lot with everything from COVID-19 to policing. Are you questioning the experts? Are you questioning the science? As an intelligent tax-paying citizen, one thing I would encourage you to remember is that an expert or a scientist is just another ordinary upper middle class citizen with a degree in a specific arena like education. So it does matter if 95% of these very human people are in one of the political camps. So yeah, Regnery and others, Fox do great work. I do agree there needs to be more buildup of this. And I think you're seeing that now. I think you're seeing the Daily Wire, for example. I consume a fair amount of conservative media, but they're hiring people like Gina Carano and Allison Williams, Adam Carolla, like actual mainstream figures. So there's like DW comedy now. Will that be enough? I don't know, but I think it makes it more difficult to just lie. If one media outlet in 5 is saying, no, every major story from the other 4/5 of this block is usually wrong, that's going to have a massive breaking effect. I'm obviously going to swing back to the other 2/3 of the panel, but we just saw this with Russiagate. The entire thing turned out to just be a set of lies. This is something that went on for 4 years? So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that experts are simply humans, often less educated than you are across fields.
Yeah, so on that topic, you guys had some really great things to say, and I really liked your phrasing of the messaging of with the purpose of excluding and destroying things that we don't want, that people don't want to hear. This happened in this past year with the American Booksellers Association, the ABA. They're a national nonprofit trade organization that promotes and connects books with independent booksellers. They're a distributor, and all their job is to distribute books. That's their job. And they mailed out one of our books, a book by Abigail Schreier. And it's down there. I will make you get down to get it. It's called Irreversible Damage. But when they mailed out this book, they got one complaint on Twitter, one. And they sent out an official apology saying that we have traumatized and endangered the members of the trans community by mailing the book out. This is a serious and violent incident that goes against the ABA's ends and policies, values, and everything we believe in and support. It is inexcusable. And so I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think about this language that's being used? Where are they getting this language? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I can start with the word violence. There's this term came out of academia. It's called discursive violence. That is language use that is deemed violent. Again, it stems out of postmodern ideas that language in and of itself is a form of action, that it has this kind of efficacy, and that it has this kind of power that an act itself has. And this filtered into legal studies through critical race theory and other types of studies. And so the idea then is that language is violent, and this is a means by which people get shut up, basically. To the left, your language is violence, or your speech is violence, and our violence is speech. That's basically what it comes down to. In other words, we can burn down buildings up and down the street, and that's just free expression. But if you actually talk and say things we don't like, that's violent. So this is the standard that we're under. So I think it's pathetic on the part of this distributor to cave to these Twitter mobs, even if it's especially if it's one person.
One person.
Even if it's a Twitter mob. A lot of them are bots. Plenty of them are these people are just phrase repeaters. Basically, I say that they have this lexicon of woke ideology or woke phraseology. It's plug and play rhetoric. They have all these words. They plug them in and then they spit them out and they say them. They may as well be computer bots or AI agents, because they have every bit as much predictability as a computer application. They're so boring, and their sameness in their words that they use, like it's almost identical. They all sound alike. They're like Agent Smith in the Matrix. They're all identical, and they just repeat the same things.
Yeah, there's actually a term for that, NPC. The idea that if you're arguing with someone online, they're just going to repeat set woke rhetoric without really coming up with any new arguments or any innovations. That's often true. So I think that there are two things that actually come into play there. One of them is the redefinition of language by sort of the postmodern left. And you see this go well beyond what we're talking about here. I mean, so in my arena, when someone like Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo says you're racist, they don't actually mean you're racist in the sense that you genetically dislike people of another race. What they mean is something like you support any system in the USA that produces different outcomes for people of different races. So the argument is that the SAT, for example, is racist because whites outscore blacks and blacks often outscore Latinos. And the only reason this could occur, the only way this could occur, is through some kind of hidden, subtle prejudice in society. This, of course, doesn't answer the question of why Asians outscore everybody. But that's the argument. The word racism has been redefined to mean any system that is seen as advantaging white people. The same thing with violence. Like, I was actually born on the south side of Chicago, so come from a military family. So the idea that it is violent to speak freely as opposed to beat someone up strikes me as utterly ridiculous. But someone said this in an academic paper, and now other people can say, well, following the lead of bell hooks, I describe unwanted speech as a form of violence against people of color. So we're dealing with this silly, constant word redefinition. A big problem, I think, quite seriously, is that the other side has most of the English teachers. So we have to, and I don't mean that as a joke. We have to, speaking in a bookstore, we have to respond to this. When someone defines opposing every system in the USA as anti-racist, as Dr. Ibram Kendi in fact does, because all of these systems produce slightly different outcomes for blacks and whites and Asians and Latinos. When someone says that's anti-racism, you have to redefine that and say, no, that's neo-racism or something like that. Word redefinition is an issue. So is social media. I don't want to ramble on about this, but the idea that the people on social media are very representative of the country is simply false. If I can ask just short show of hands, how many of you have a Twitter account with more than, say, 100 followers? All right, we got 2 in the room. Solid group of taxpayers in here. I mean, that's about typical. That's what I see when I give speeches. So the people on Twitter are, in general, they're young, upper class, coastal. They're mostly college kids, if you ever look at Twitter's demographics. So saying that something doesn't play on Twitter, saying something like Mike Pence is unpopular on Twitter, which may be one of the silliest single analyses I've ever heard, whatever you might think of the former Veep, it's just meaningless. So 1, we have to cling to real definitions of words, and 2, don't focus too much on the artificial world, social media, Twitter, Instagram, and the whole world beyond that, Meta, Second Life, so on down the line. Focus on First Life. Go out and actually talk to people, and you'll see what Americans think, I think. So the social media influence is very real. I know it's real in academia. I imagine it's real in publishing, but it's mostly fake. Last line, I was on Twitter the other day. I actually do have about 50,000 Twitter followers if anyone wants to follow me. But I logged on and I saw a person whose Twitter AVI was a vagina, keeping this polite, arguing with a person whose Twitter AVI was a Roman statue, indicating that they're probably on the right. Both these people were under one of my Twitter posts, and I just logged out. There's no real point in engaging in that conversation. I think the statue probably had the better points. But these aren't real people. These are cartoon characters created in the metaverse. Yeah. So actually focus on your fellow citizens. That's a good idea for every business.
Yes, excellent point. And real quick, I wanted to make a correction on that. The one person who complained, that was in relation to Target taking the book off their website briefly, the same book, transgender book. And this other time with the distributors with the ABA, a couple of booksellers who received the book complained. So I just want to make sure I had that clarification. There was one person, but that was in relation to Target, and Target did end up putting it back up.
I don't see any media here, so I'm not worried.
My conscience. All right. Well, we have yes, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to open this up for questions from you guys, for either Will or Michael or both of them. And we have a microphone here too. If you want to raise your hand, and
I did want to add one point about the redefinition of words before we go, because this is exactly what Orwell talks about in 1984, and this is exactly what happens in the Soviet Union, where language changes meaning, and this is a way of distorting reality so that people can't trust their own senses, and they have no idea. There's a total disorientation, and this makes them very easy to control.
Yes, just one quick sentence. Political correctness is actually, you might correct me on this, Michael, but it's a Soviet term.
It came from Lenin. Lenin invented the term.
Yeah, it's Soviet, not Chinese, but that was the only conflict in my mind. But so the idea was that something can be wrong, but you still have to say it. In a classroom, I'd probably repeat that. Something can be wrong, but everyone still has to say it because it's governmentally correct. It's correct under the law. And we're now seeing this with, I think transracialism will be the movement beyond transgenderism. But I mean, the idea of dead naming on campuses, the idea that you have to identify students as, if they are multi-ethnic, for example, the race they identify with, the gender, of course, is where this began, that they identify with. And those two things in some situations are harmless, but this is going to continue going on. We now recognize the director of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, said yesterday that wearing ordinary non-N95 masks reduces your chance of getting COVID-19 by 80%. That's just not true. But it remains up on the CDC account. So we seem to be seeing an increasing wave of people saying things that are not fact. And I don't think this is entirely a left-wing thing, but that's who's in charge now, at least in discourse. But we're seeing people say things that absolutely are not true and then command you to agree with the thing that is not true at risk of, for example, losing your job. So.
Are there any questions? Yes, sir, in the back. If you state your name, if you have an affiliation, or if you just book buyer. So for the live stream, he asked, where do you see us now?
Well,
where are we going down the road?
I think that, frankly, this may not be popular, but you know what? This is the what's the name of this topic? This panel again?
State of speech.
Safe speech. This may not be safe speech, but I think that the woke social justice business has basically morphed into and basically made possible the COVID narrative as well, and the way that people are being canceled, just like they were for incorrect political speech. Now they're being canceled for incorrect science, for not following the science. There's slews of medical doctors and scientists who are totally object with the mainstream narrative of what's going on. And I think what I'm seeing going on here is a kind of woke COVID totalitarianism developing. And I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I think it's very scary. That's where I'll leave it.
My honest take is I think a lot of this will be regional and local. I mean, one of the issues with the American elite, so when we talk about wokeness, we're talking about a particular thing, which in academic writing I would call the discursive elite. You're talking about the fact that 93 to 95% of academics and mass media journalists are on the far left. That's a reality. But I think that the problem with this elite is that most of the people in the country don't really respect it at all. I mean, Thomas Sowell, who all of you should read as much of as possible while we're in a bookstore, but Thomas Sowell decades ago called this the vision of the anointed, right? He said there's a specific group of coastal, mostly white, all that doesn't really matter. Now they're diversifying, urban, lower upper class, Ivy League, maybe Big Ten or SEC, overeducated people that run these specific sectors of the country, like academia. But one of Sowell's points was that the anointed have a limited reach of power because many of the states are full of people that view them as idiots, that come from the other large collegiate conferences, or where the leaders come from the military, the union sector, a number of other things. So I think when you talk about COVID, one of the things we've noticed is that powerful governors like DeSantis and Abbott just aren't doing what they're being told to. So I think that wokeness will continue up to a breaking point in academia. Personally, as someone who is a betting man, I'm a pretty heavy investor. I see that breaking point about 25 years when this crap gets into the hard sciences and we start really losing to China. The moment we fall behind, say, a third place power like the EU, I think there's going to be the same sort of revisionism we saw when we started losing the space race to Russia. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But even in the meantime, I think in Kentucky, for example, there's going to be a significant backlash if you look at these school board moms, so on, against a lot of this stuff. So I think on the East Coast, and where I'm from in Chicago, it'll probably be almost unbearable for about 2 decades. Other places, I think it'll depend radically on who the people are there. And this is kind of a task service for you guys, what the people there do.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that. I agree there's this regionalism, and that makes things different, and that gives a lot of space for people. And I must admit that I do have a sort of I'm involved in the East Coast. I've been majorly an urbanite. Lived in New York for 11 years, and then now I live in Pittsburgh. So I'm talking about. I do agree that my experience is inflected by those regional variations, but the vaccine rollout is not dependent upon regions, and the facts about it are not dependent upon regions, and the people that are working for these companies are across all these regions. The people that are going to get fired or already have been fired because they work for a company that requires them to have the vaccine if they have more than 100 employees, that is not regional. There are many things that are across the whole country and across the whole world. Not to disagree with it, China is light years ahead of us in fourth industrial revolution technologies. That is AI, machine learning, robotics, and effectively automation. They're light years ahead of us. These technologies combined with particular ideology, which is what I argue in Google Archipelago, these technologies combined with an authoritarian ideology is a very frightening prospect, because this can be enforced by virtue of technological imposition.
Yeah, I think just a quick response there. Yeah, I think that the truth may well be somewhere in the middle. I agree with a lot of that. I do think that in terms of some of the states like Florida under DeSantis have actually, as I understand, addressed some of this. Like, the simple rule, I suppose, would be something like, in this state, you can block an OSHA inspector at the door, or you cannot reveal, X component of your healthcare policy. True. So no one would know then, or no one would be able to access employees and see how many people to fine whatever absurd amount it is, $140,000 per violation. That's what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, they increased it under the new mandate. But so, I mean, I think what you're going to see is some of the red states taking that whole idea to court. The mandate is not implementable for 120 days, as I understand, which is an odd thing, considering the whole argument is that we're on the edge of the precipice and we're all going to die. But first, we're going to wait a bit over 100 days to let the legal expert, let legal take a look at this and so on. But I do think that most of this will vary to an extraordinary degree regionally. Mask policies set at the state level. The China thing is problematic. I mean, we're not alone in the world. So, I mean, a couple weeks ago, two things happened at once. China launched the first intercontinental low-flight non-ballistic missile. It's a pure smart missile that can fly around the world. And we announced that the U.S. Army and the rest of the federal government now has a formal gender policy. So, I mean, we announced that there are going to be certain things we do to make female soldiers feel more welcome, and we're looking for more diversity. We're going to have some more accommodations for pregnant soldiers, if I recall. I don't think that's an exaggeration. So that's not a good thing. The reality, though, is I think after we lose a couple big skirmishes with the Chinese, even nationally, America is a tough and competitive country. People are going to start saying, enough with this nonsense. We don't want an exactly proportional mix of diverse people flying planes necessarily. We want the best pilots flying planes, because we might have to go to war with the Chinese government. So I think the pressure of reality exerts a strong downward press on fantasy. That's why people stop becoming small children mentally, or stop being small children mentally. And I suppose that happens to societies as well. We've had it too good for too long, but that's about to change.
Those are great points. Yeah, I think I talk about this in terms of death by diversity. Hopefully we don't get to the point where bridges are falling down because some engineering professor said that rigor was a bad thing in engineering, which they did. They said rigor was phallocentric and was, it basically recalled the erection of the male of the species. So they had to get rid of rigor from engineering education. And if they get rid of rigor from engineering education, you'll have death by diversity. Your bridges will fall down, your buildings will crash. But like Wilfred said, the reality pushes back against these nonsense ideas eventually.
Some very quick final comments there. First of all, I actually once had a feminist girlfriend tell me that buildings were phallic symbols. And what this seemed to mean was that they all go up. None of them are, I guess, internal. Few of them are in caves. So, I mean, she would look at skylines and be quite critical of them. But moving, and there are major feminist articles about this, the phallocentrism of building.
How long did you date her?
We went on 3 dates. At any rate, so I'm currently in a relationship with someone else who's my fiance. So, that happened.
Maybe that was a fantasy because these buildings are always erect.
Always hard. Okay, let's
moving on.
Yeah, I mean, again, they can't be built around, a cotton core or something like that. So a lot of feminism is nonsense too, but that wasn't the topic of today's speech. But anyway, I do think that we are seeing some of this already. I mean, there was a bridge. You can look this up. I think everything Michael and I have said today is factual, although we obviously I'm biased to the center right pretty openly. But there actually was a specific bridge that was built by an all-female, very sexually diverse group of engineers that was really hailed in the building trades press as like the future of the field, and it did fall down about a year ago. So there are many great female engineers, but if the primary first goal is this type of diversity, how many bisexual Greek women are on the team or something like that, I think you will see the result. But again, we have to compete in consensus reality. And I think a lot of people are going to do lip service to this kind of nonsense while going on competing in consensus reality. I mean, Microsoft gave their minute-long land acknowledgement yesterday. If any of you saw this, we concede that our campus was the former home of the Squacomish tribe or whatnot. And then they went on being one of the leading computer powers in the world. They're not going to give the campus land back. So,
all right. Well, thank you both for being here. This has been a great conversation. And thank you all for coming. If you have any more questions for them, they will be out signing books. And yeah, they'll be here afterwards as well. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.